Adams, Tennessee, a small town with a big secret. For over 2 centuries, whispers of malevolent spirit have haunted the region. This is the story of the Bell Witch, one of America's most chilling and enduring legends. Welcome back, everyone, to my channel. My name is Florio, and today we will be diving into the folklore story of the Bell Witch. I won't be going into my usual deep dive of picking apart a story. Instead, I want to do an episode where we just kind of share a creepy story together. That being said, however, I can't fully resist talking about debunks, and there are definitely some possible explanations and debunks of this story, at least certain parts of the story, that have been floating around for a while. So I am going to touch on them, but I'll do that at the end. Mainly, I just want you to kind of enjoy the story with me. All right, let's get started. The story of the Bell Witch. Our story begins with a farmer named John Bell, who married a woman named Lucy Williams in 1782. They had a farm in Edgecombe County, North Carolina. They were quite successful in their original farm, and it gave them the funds needed to make the move to a large 320-acre farmland in Robertson County, Tennessee, in 1804. Robertson County is now known as Adams, Tennessee. They settled into their new farm with their 9 children: Jesse, John Jr., Drury, Benjamin, Esther, Zadok, Elizabeth, Richard Williams, Joel, and Egbert. John moved there with his family for a fresh start in a more quiet and peaceful land, as this area is thick with forests, giving lots to work with. For 13 years, the family lived happy and prosperous. During that time, they ended up having 3 more children, including their youngest, Betsy, who was born in 1806. They were devout Christians attending the Red River Baptist Church. They also were very involved in the church community and events. Everyone liked the family. There didn't seem to be any grievances towards them. However, their quiet, idyllic life would soon come crashing down upon them. In 1817, everything would change with a chance event, beginning one of the most infamous hauntings in American history. One day, John Bell was walking around his farm and he would see a monstrous creature. He described it as having the body of a dog with the head of a rabbit, covered in thick black fur. John fired his weapon at the animal, but it disappeared like an apparition. Then that night, the activity picked up and began to attack the family home. The family would be kept up frightened as they heard knocking and scratching along the doors and walls, and disembodied whispers in the dead of night. When they checked outside, they found nothing, just the crickets and the breeze in the grass. The next day, John's son Drew would then see an odd-looking, oversized bird perched on a fence that flew off when he tried to approach it. Lastly, Dean, a slave belonging to the Bell family, reported being followed by a large black dog numerous times. He said he saw it had 2 heads, but sometimes also no head at all. He began carrying an axe and something called a witch ball that his wife made for him to protect him. The activity at night would get worse and worse. The family heard sounds of gnawing on the beds and invisible dog packs fighting, growling, barking, and howling. Soon after, the sounds would begin to get more strange, boulders crashing to the ground and chains dragging along the floors. Then human sounds would begin. It started with gulping and chewing that would be heard first. But the phenomena began to grow more intense as sheets were pulled from beds when the children slept. Their hair was tugged and their faces were scratched by an invisible force. The entity began speaking in whispers, eventually growing in power, it would seem, as it revealed itself to be intelligent. It would hold conversations, sing hymns, and even quote scripture. But as the entity's voice got louder and more clear, the attacks on the kids got more severe. John's daughter Betsy became the primary target of the entity's aggression. She was slapped, pinched, stuck with pins, and left with many bruises by an invisible force. The entity would also begin to tie her hair to the bedpost at night. John tried to hide it from the church and community. He was scared they would be accused as witches or working with the devil. The witch trials of Europe and the US were still fresh in the minds of people. The family spent a year suffering behind closed doors, keeping it from the community. The attacks on Betsy just kept getting worse and worse. Slapped across the face daily, every time stronger and stronger, leaving behind welts and bruises. She had bite marks all over her body and her skin bled from the pinpricks. Apparently, some injuries left behind the outline of a hand as well. Betsy began spending time with a neighbor boy, Joshua Gardner, taking walks with him away from home so she could get a break from the chaos. The closer she became with Joshua, however, it seemed to make the entity more aggressive. Pretty soon into their courting, they asked their parents if they could get married. Betsy just wanted to leave that house and escape the torment. The families agreed and they began to plan the wedding. The entity began to threaten her and her family if she didn't call off the engagement. And this is where an interesting character shows up in the story. Richard Powell, a local teacher who was 11 years her senior, he taught Betsy and Joshua. As it turns out, he was in love with Betsy and hoped to marry her when she got older. But apparently, he was already secretly married to Esther Scott, a woman who lived in Nashville. Supposedly, there were rumors that Richard practiced the occult and witchcraft. So the thought was that he sent the spirit over to their home. But these rumors were something that came up generations later in retelling, so who knows what's really true. Eventually, the father, John Bell, couldn't take it anymore. He turned to a family friend, James Johnson, for help. After retiring for the evening at the Bell home, Johnson was awakened that night by the same phenomena. That morning, he told John it was a spirit, just like in the Bible. James insisted they go speak with the preacher that morning, which John agreed to do. The preacher promised to keep it all secret. Unfortunately, he didn't. The haunting was no longer a secret. Soon, word of the haunting spread and it became a local sensation, with hundreds of people traveling great distances just to see the witch. The crowds only made the entity or spirit stronger. It was becoming louder and more forceful than ever before. It seemed to gain strength from fear and religion. The spirit would sing hymns, quote scripture, and even recite sermons to whoever would listen. People reported seeing heavy items thrown around. Secrets of other people were whispered in their ears. Once the spirit repeated word for word 2 different sermons that were happening 12 miles apart. One of the reverends of the sermons, Reverend James Johnson, his son John was a skeptic and he went out to prove that it was all a hoax. He asked the entity what his grandmother in North Carolina would say to her slaves when they didn't obey her. The spirit responded in his grandmother's voice exactly and said, "Hut, tut, what has happened now?" Another skeptic was an Englishman who traveled to the Bell farm to prove that the spirit didn't exist. While he was there, he heard his parents' disembodied voices, his parents who were back in England. Once he heard those voices, he got so scared he ran and never returned. William Porter, who was a friend of the Bell family, encountered the spirit while he was staying there. While he was sleeping, a terrible stench filled the room, and he watched the entity crawl into bed with him. He acted quickly and grabbed it, wrapped it in his clothes, and tried to throw it in the fire, but it was so dense and heavy he could barely lift it. It is said, as he got closer to the fire, it got so heavy that he couldn't carry it at all and he dropped it completely. A committee of neighbors formed to investigate the haunting further and try to figure out how they could help the Bell family. One neighbor asked the spirit one day,
"Who are you and what do you want?"
And the voice answered feebly, "I am a spirit. I was once very happy but have been disturbed and made unhappy. I am the spirit of a person who is buried in the woods nearby, and the grave was disturbed, my bones scattered, and one of my teeth was lost under this house, and I am here looking for that tooth." At one point, and I know this is the unfortunate trope, it was claimed that it had been released from a Native American burial ground that the farm was built on when one of John's sons disturbed the grave. The spirit also sent several men on a hunt for buried treasure that didn't exist. And the spirit claimed a few different identities, but the one that caused the most concern was Kate Batts. Kate had sold John Bell the land for his farm. She was already an outcast in the community. She was loud, mean, and demanded attention and pity because her husband Frederick had been paralyzed in an accident and couldn't work. Kate had tried to do physical labor in order to provide for her family because they needed the money. And because they needed the money, she ended up selling a good portion of her land to John Bell. But shortly after the sale, she realized that the land was worth much more than he had paid, so she blamed John for taking advantage of her family. At one point, it is said that she said to him, "I vow to haunt John Bell and his descendants until their dying day." When the family first started hearing noises outside their house, John assumed that it was Kate. But when things started to escalate, he knew she wasn't capable of sneaking around the house and tormenting the children without being seen. So that's when rumors started up at church that Kate was possibly a witch. People began to speculate that God had punished her by paralyzing her husband and causing her family's financial troubles. John then began to think Kate cast a spell on his family or sent a demon their way as revenge. Kate denied any wrongdoing, but the spirit started answering to the name Kate. The spirit continued to escalate the haunting, getting louder and more violent each day. One day, it revealed its real reason for being there. The spirit intended to take the life of John Bell, claiming that he is a bad man. There's a side tangent to this story I'll add in, which is the story of President Andrew Jackson. People say Andrew Jackson was the first person to call the spirit the Bell Witch. At that time, though, he was just Major Lieutenant Andrew Jackson. He wouldn't be elected president until 1829. He was, however, a national hero after winning the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. The story goes the three eldest Bell sons had fought under General Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans, and so he traveled to the farm. Some say they stopped there out of necessity, some say that he was visiting. When they reached the property, the horses suddenly stopped, and they thought the wagon was stuck at first, but after inspecting it carefully, there's no reason why it couldn't keep rolling. Then they heard a voice say, "You may proceed, but I will meet you again later tonight." After this, the horse had stepped forward and continued onto the farm. Andrew Jackson then called out,
"By the eternal boys, that must be the Bell Witch."
As they settled in for the night, one of the men claimed to be a tamer of evil spirits. He announced that he had a silver bullet in his pistol called the Witch Tamer that would actually scare away the Bell Witch. As soon as he finished speaking, he fell to the ground and started convulsing. He screamed out in pain and said that he was being poked with needles and he was being jerked all around like he was being shoved and punched, and then he felt a strong kick to his backside that was so forceful he flew right out the Bell family's door and landed on the porch. Then the Bell Witch was heard saying, "There's one more fraud among you. I will root him out and come for him tomorrow night." The soldiers were terrified and wanted to leave, but Andrew Jackson refused as he wanted to know who the other fraud was. So he announced that they would stay one more night at the farm. But early in the morning the next day, something happened that was so horrifying, Andrew rounded up his men and fled back to Nashville before the sun even came up. We will be revisiting this Andrew Jackson story again at the end of the video. After Andrew Jackson left, the spirit continued to focus on Betsy, both physically and psychologically. One day, Betsy was terrified when she saw the ghostly figure of a young girl wearing a green dress swinging from an oak tree. Oddly, though, as much as the spirit seemed to hate Betsy, she was very fond of her mother, Lucy. Lucy would find fresh fruit waiting for her in the kitchen as a gift brought to her from the spirit, and at night she would be serenaded as well. The spirit called Lucy the most perfect woman to walk the earth. The spirit also liked John Jr. and was always respectful towards him. But the spirit's reason for being there, to take out John Sr., still haunted the family. Ever since its arrival in 1817, his health has gone downhill. He was almost 70 years old now and was struggling to eat and drink. His jaw would often seize up and his face go paralyzed, leaving him unable to swallow. He would oftentimes have convulsive episodes, which were probably seizures. The Bell Witch always laughed at him and seemed delighted that his health was failing. She would say to him, "I hate old Jack Bell, and he will be gone by the fall of 1820. John rarely left the house and mostly stayed in bed. When he would try to get up and move around a little, the Bell Witch would snatch away his shoes before he could even put them on. His throat would often swell, his seizures would get worse, and he grew weaker and weaker by the day. The Bell Witch continued to taunt and threaten him daily. When he would have a seizure, she would slap his face and laugh at him. A few days before Christmas in 1820, John suffered multiple violent seizures and fell into a coma. His family gathered around him as he lay unconscious in his bed, and he passed on December 20th at 70 years old. Lucy and the children were devastated, but they were comforted that he had at least died peacefully. But then John Jr. found a strange bottle of liquid in a cupboard that none of them had ever seen before. He decided to give a little bit of the liquid to the family's cat, and a few seconds after the cat lapping it up, it collapsed and passed. The Bell Witch then called out, I gave old Jack a dose of that last night, which fixed him. Also note, there are other versions of the story where the vial's found beside John in the fireplace, and also versions that say the doctor gave it to the cat. John Jr. was horrified, so much so that he threw the bottle into the fireplace to burn it. But when he did, it exploded into a bright blue flame. And this flame formed a ball, almost like a flowing blue orb, which then hovered in the air before it flew up into the chimney. John's funeral was one of the largest ever held in Robertsons County. He was well respected and beloved by the church. As everyone gathered in the cemetery to say their final goodbyes, the casket was lowered into the ground. And that's when the mourners heard shrieking laughter. It was the Bell Witch. She cackled loudly and then started singing a cheerful song about drinking a bottle of liquor. And she kept on singing until the last person left the cemetery. The Bell family feared that with John gone, the haunting might get worse, and for a little while, it actually mostly stopped. Just as they started to sigh in relief, the Bell Witch returned to accomplish her second goal, ending Betsy's engagement to Joshua Gardner. The Bell Witch followed Betsy and Joshua wherever they went, cursing their marriage and their future children. Betsy would constantly be slapped, shoved, pricked, and pinched whenever she was at home. It didn't take long before Betsy would break, and on Easter in 1821, she met Joshua near the bank of the river and told him she couldn't marry him. Interestingly enough, that same year, Esther Scott suddenly passed away as well. Remember, she was the secret wife of Betsy's teacher, Richard Powell, who wanted to marry Betsy. The timing was suspicious, but regardless, 3 years later, Betsy married him. The Bell Witch visited Lucy one last time, and she said, "I will return in 7 years' time." After over 3 years, they thought the spirit was finally gone, but she did return in 1828. Lucy lived on the farm with her 2 sons, Richard and Joel, who urged their mother not to engage with the spirit. The Bell Witch stayed for just a few weeks and spent most of the time with John Jr. having long discussions about religion and philosophy. The witch supposedly also gave John Jr. predictions about the Civil War that came true. The Bell Witch admitted to John Jr. that she had a very good reason for taking out his father, but she refused to tell him what it was. On her last visit, she said she'd be back in 107 years, which would be 1935, and she would visit his closest descendant, but many believe she never left. The Bell Witch legend persists to this day, deeply rooted in the folklore of Tennessee. The Bell Witch Cave, located near the original Bell Farm, has become a popular tourist attraction where visitors claim to experience the strange occurrences. The Cave. Part of the legend of the Bell Witch is a place called the Bell Witch Cave, which is located near the Bell Farm. And there is a story that Betsy and some of her friends were exploring the cave when a young boy in the group got stuck in a hole, and apparently the Bell Witch said, "I'll get him out," and an invisible hand wrapped around his ankles and yanked him free. The Bell Witch then warned the kids about the dangers of wandering through the caves, and some believe that when the Bell Witch left, she actually retreated to the cave itself and made it her home. Some people report that bones have been found in the cave, and there's a story going around that the cave was a burial site for Aboriginals, or the bones were moved from the Bell Farm because they were found when he was digging up, and that regardless, they're still Aboriginal bones. So we're getting into the whole burial ground thing. However, I couldn't find anything to corroborate that these bones even exist, and I suspect it's just a hook into the horrible trope of Native American burial ground hauntings. So if anyone has any proof otherwise, though, feel free to share it below as well. All right, let's get into a quick rundown of some of the modern day stories that followed up on the folklore where we left off. 20th Century Sightings. All right, the first story I don't have a year for this one, but a modern day Lucy Bell Butler, who's a descendant of John Bell Jr. and the namesake of John Bell's wife, Lucy. I know that sounds confusing, but she's a descendant, all right? She was named after Lucy. She said that the Bell Witch stories were a regular part of her childhood. Whenever anything happened that was good or bad, her family would say it was the Bell Witch. So Lucy believes the Bell Witch is real and still watches over her family. And when her daughter Jennifer was growing up, she could see a young girl giggling and running through the house. And Lucy believes this little girl was the good side of the Bell Witch. But she also went on to say that she thinks that the Bell Witch punished the people that she needed to and took care of the ones that she liked. So this folklore has been going around for quite a while, passed down through the family. All right, next story, and I have a year for this one, is 1937. There's actually two stories in this one. So number one, Lewis Garrison owned the property that included the Bell Farm and the Bell Witch Cave. He said that he often heard strange noises that he couldn't explain. People describe it as the sound of something rubbing against a house. Also, faint piano music was heard randomly at times too, without explanation. All right, story number two, we're still in 1937 in the summer. Local Epworth League, which was a church social group, they were having a barbecue in a rock quarry that was near the cave. The group were joking about the legend when they saw a figure of a woman sitting on top of the cliff over the cave, causing many to flee. According to the newspaper, a minister in the group later claimed to have investigated it and discovered it was moonlight on a rock. The second report, however, concluded with a weather report that said the moon was barely noticeable that night. Jim Brooks published in 2015 that his mother was in attendance at this roast, and she said that the minister caught up to the group on the road, saying that he found no explanation for the figure. So that story is a little bit of, inconsistencies. All right, our next story comes from 1965. November 1965, an article was published that wrote about an antique oak rocking chair said to have been previously owned by attorney Charlie Willett, who was a Bell descendant. The rocking chair was acquired in Willett's estate. A customer sat down in the chair after learning that it was not for sale, and while rocking in the chair asked Mrs. Adams if she believed in the supernatural. 2 weeks later, the customer's daughter visited the home of Miss Adams and said that after her mother had left and visited the Bell Cemetery, a voice told her, "Stand up and look around, you will find something of much value." That was a quote. After some car trouble, the woman walked out into a field and found a black iron kettle turned over. Underneath the kettle, she found a pearl buckle in the grass. The woman's daughter reported that a jeweler estimated the buckle to be around 160 to 200 years old. Our next story is 1977. It's actually multiple stories. So, story one. Bonnie Henlin told people a story from 1944. She was playing hooky from school with a group of friends, and they went to the cave. She borrowed a lantern from the cave and they went inside. But the lantern kept blowing at the flame despite no breeze inside the cave. Every time she relit it, it would blow it out yet again. Terrified, they crawled along the water path to get out of the darkness until they finally reached the entrance again. At the entrance, they saw an open can of pork and beans and marshmallows as well. Later on that evening, they ended up finding out that law enforcement discovered 2 escaped fugitives in the back of the cave. She credited the witch with helping them to avoid running into the escaped convicts, so essentially the witch protected them from them. All right, second story. 5 soldiers from nearby Fort Campbell went to the Bell Witch Cave. One of the soldiers was sitting on a rock and he was talking how he's like a skeptic and he didn't believe any of the legend. Which then apparently some invisible hand grabbed him around the chest and threw him to the ground. And then he was a believer. I don't know if it's true. All right, our next story is 1986. Writer David Gerard for the Tennessean and photographer Bill Wilson, they were given permission to sleep in the cave overnight. They ended up hearing a noise from deeper in the cave. They heard it was like a unwavering groan is what they called it. And it would get louder and louder, accompanied by several loud thumps. When it began a third time, the men ran to the entrance sort of out of fear. Then they explored the wiring, looked at the lights, seeing if there was some reason for the noises. They're trying to kind of explain it after. They couldn't find explanation in that sense, and they ended up going back into the cave. Once they entered back in again, they heard a rumble near the entrance. Walking back over to the entrance, they then discovered that the rumble was the noise from a jet. So they assumed, I guess the first noise must have been a jet or something like that too. So they went to go walk back inside the cave. As they went to walk back inside, they heard a loud, high-pitched scream from inside. It frightened them so much that they left and they did not end up spending the night. All right. This story from 1987. This one is just silly. So part of the legend of the Bell Witch is that she could transform into any sort of animal or creature or whatever. So in this story, H.C. Sanders is the owner of a nearby gas station. He reported 20 years earlier that he ran out of gas at night near the Red River across from the Bell Witch Cave. He began to walk towards town when a rabbit came out of the woods and began to follow him. He, being a believer in the legend, thought that this must be the witch. It's a rabbit, right? So he ended up walking faster, but the rabbit kept pace even as he broke out into a run. After about a mile, Sanders sat down on a log to catch his breath. The rabbit hopped up on the other side of the log, looked at him, and he said, and I quote, "Hell of a race we had there, wasn't it?" So we ended on a silly story. All right, those are all the modern stories we have, other than, ghost hunters on YouTube. That being said, historians, skeptics, and paranormal enthusiasts have proposed numerous theories about the haunting, ranging from hoaxes and psychological phenomena to genuine paranormal activity. So let's talk a little bit about what the skeptics have to say. Skeptics Say. We're going to start off with the first thing is Andrew Jackson. Remember I told you guys about that story about President Andrew Jackson, and I said we would return to the story again? Well, here it is here. Andrew Jackson. Paranormal investigator Benjamin Radford, as well as Brian Dunning, found there's no evidence that Andrew Jackson visited the Bell family home or would have even been near it on their travel path as well. During the years in question, Jackson's movements were very well documented. Also, nowhere in history or in any of his writings is there evidence of even knowing the Bell family. But secondly, according to Dunning, and I quote, "The 1824 presidential election was notoriously malicious, and it seems hard to believe that his opponent would have overlooked the opportunity to drag him through the mud for having lost a fight to a witch." Carl Lindahl, affiliated with the University of Houston, also reported that Andrew Jackson's encounter is an example of how belief and history mix together to form a legend. Essentially, how we come up with these tall tales. Mass hysteria. I'm adding this in here as I do with a lot of my debunks because honestly, I know I bring it up a lot, but you guys have to realize how common it actually is. We are very much affected by our fellow peers. It happens all the time, especially when you're in communities who have like a strong religious background, which this community did. So never rule out the possibility of mass hysteria. Kate poisoned them? Another theory that people have is that Kate is the perpetrator. People suggest that Kate was more responsible than, people gave her credit for. She was a woman, so they probably didn't give her enough credit, let's be fair. But she could have poisoned the father, for sure. She had a lot of animosity towards the family, and supposedly she was not a nice woman to anyone in the town either. So it's not a stretch to maybe think that she's responsible for this whole thing. Betsy did it. Some people do believe that Betsy did the whole thing. This is a two-pronged theory, though. First, people believe she did it to try to get her crush, Joshua, to marry her by pressuring him to save her from the witch. But second, people think that it may have been poltergeist faking syndrome, in which a younger child causes mischief and blames it on a ghost. This happens quite a lot in history, and a lot of times they end up coming clean and admitting that they faked a lot of this stuff. Also, there is an article that was presumed to not exist, but people have since proven it does exist. They found a copy of it, but it was removed because of a lawsuit. The article talks about how Betsy was a skilled ventriloquist. This is the only record of this claim, and for all we know, it could have just been media hype. We don't know for sure if it was true. But why would Betsy even do this? Like, what does killing your father have to do with marrying Joshua? Well, some people believe there may have been something darker as well at play. The John Bell cover-up. All right, just a little trigger warning, related to SA. Some skeptics have put forward a theory that the Bell Witch was a cover-up from John Sr., who was hurting Betsy. And John was either, one, poisoned by a slave who knew about it, and this version of the story was apparently backed up by a psychic, you know how I feel about psychics, who claimed that she heard it from Betsy herself. But the other option is people believe that Betsy may have just been poisoning him herself to make him weak so he would stop or even just take him out in the end. But Betsy was still being hurt the whole time, that he was weak as well. So I don't know. The story isn't really holding a ton of water to it, but you never know. The whole story is a bit strange because the haunting went on for such a long time. And there's a scientist, though, who believes that John was poisoned slowly by arsenic over a long period. So these motives don't necessarily match up to what ended up happening to them while he was being poisoned slowly. right? Poison over a long time would make sense for Kate to be doing it, though, as a form of revenge, the neighbor that they made angry, right? Arsenic poisoning. Austin Peay State University's Dr. Megan Mann, an assistant professor of chemistry, has found possible proof that John was poisoned by arsenic. As she looked into the physical symptoms reported by John, the description of the liquid in the vial, the cat's death, and the blue flame caused by the vial burning in the fire as well. This led her to investigate arsenic and lead as possible poisons because of the blue flame. Lead was quickly debunked, however, because lead would not have killed the cat in an instant. As well, the heavy metal also remains in the body for a long period of time, continually building upon itself, and they did not find any of it in his bones. But arsenic, that would take out someone very quickly, but also at the time it was very commonly used to kill mice in farms, so everyone had it at home. Cats also lack a certain type of metabolism known as glucuronic acid conjugation. I'm going to say that wrong, I'm sorry. Leading man to believe the chemical was used to poison John was metabolized through that pathway. Arsenic is metabolized through this particular glucuronic acid conjugation, allowing the body to quickly recover from small doses. So it would explain how it would take him years of just being kind of ill, but not kicking it, before he would finally go, right? Arsenic can also cause muscle twitching and spasms too, which go with his story of his physical descriptions. Mann believes that John Bell was a victim of long-term arsenic poisoning. She believes he received small doses of the poison over the course of about 3 years, and lastly, a large fatal dose on the night before he went. She says, and I quote, "We know that back then, arsenic poison became such an issue that many places in the United States and in Europe, where it was happening a lot, were actually making laws specifically to punish people who were accused and found guilty of poisoning people with arsenic. It was such a big thing, they had to make it a law. As for who could have done the poisoning, well, we discussed a few key suspects many believe might be the actual culprits. However, she also points out that the Bell family was very wealthy and owned numerous slaves, so it could have also been slaves doing it for all we know. And the slaves may have been responsible for all the haunting. When they retell the story what happened, they tend to leave out where the slaves were located. Were they sleeping on the grounds? Were they away? We don't usually hear about that part of the story, so we don't have that information. Also, who knows? Maybe he was actually hurting his wife. It was very common back then for that to happen. Look at Aqua Tofana and how women were driven to poison husbands to escape their clutches. We never know, but all that stuff could be possible. Folklore versus fakelore. All right, lastly is the historical debunk and a debunk of the debunk. So yeah, I know it gets confusing. So that last newspaper article, that was also part of this book that was written by an author named Ingram, who was, I believe, a descendant of the Bells, but specifically he said he had a journal from one of the Bells from back in the day. He ended up writing a whole book called the Bell Witch something or other. I don't remember the name off the top of my head right now. But now, because that article went missing and because the Jackson visit was debunked, this caused scholars to just debunk the whole book, right? But the article did turn up, and I think I saw in 2019 or something along those lines, also with some papers proving that the journal was real. So this points to Ingram's story possibly being more accurately researched than first thought. Maybe he did embellish some parts. Maybe the story about the president was just an old folklore thing that people told. We don't know. It could have just been a local legend that was made up that people took some claim to fame and it was just never corrected. Of course, this doesn't prove the paranormal part of the story, but the article itself blames Betsy for causing the whole thing. So if anything, his book even kind of debunks the paranormal part, even though it tells the story of the paranormal part. So it is an interesting back and forth, this theory. I have linked the article for and against this debunk as well. Feel free to read more about it if you're curious. Whether you believe the story or not, the Bell Witch has left an indelible mark on history and culture. The Bell Witch legend is a tale of fear, mystery, and the unknown. whether a true haunting or a powerful story passed down through generations. Today, the Bell Witch legend remains a powerful part of local folklore. Visitors from all around the world come to Adams, Tennessee to explore the cave and hear all the chilling stories. But tell me, what do you think about this story? Leave your comments below and let me know. Also, you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Liking also helps with the algorithm, helps kind of grow the channel, so I do appreciate it very much. As well, I just want to end this video thanking my members and patrons. It's very much appreciated, all the support that you guys give to the channel. I do appreciate it so much. If anyone's wondering, with membership you get videos about 24 hours ahead of time, ad-free to view, and also when I do have a live recording going on with like KK or someone, you can also attend that as well. It's members only live, just to give you guys a bit of information about memberships. Don't worry about what to watch next because I have linked a video, or if you want to sit and watch things for a little bit longer, a whole playlist on the side here. Go ahead and click those now to keep watching.